Adding color and fine finishes to your work will make it stand out above all the rest. It is that finishing touch that makes a big, big difference. Welcome to Chapter 5 of 21st Century Leathercraft. My name is George Hurst, and I'll be your instructor today for this program on dyeing and finishing. In this program, we will present a variety of basic techniques. Emphasis on the word basic, because there are literally thousands of techniques and combinations of techniques available to finish and color your leatherwork. Here are just a few of the techniques we'll be presenting in this program. There are an unlimited array of products available from many, many different companies to dye and finish your leathercraft projects. Here are just a few of my favorites that we will use in this program. Rather than presenting the information today by categories of products and techniques, we will incorporate them into several projects. So instead of just doing a generic demonstration of these products and techniques, we will actually show how to use them to make finished items. Solid color dyeing is the most basic of all the techniques you'll get into. It is usually done on a rather plain leather, such as a basket weave, a geometric stamped, or something that you just want to be in a dark color. The dark color is usually the best on doing solid color dyeing. Now, first of all, let me tell you that you need to have an area to work in that is covered with newspaper or something, just in case you should happen to spill something. It will go on the newspaper and not on your fine table. It's a very simple thing to just dip in with a dauber, take the excess off on the edge of the bottle. Now, it's very important that your leather be completely dry and free of any residue. It's sometimes a problem if you would get some rubber cement or some other substance on there. It will prevent the dye from penetrating. Notice that I'm putting it on in a circular motion. And notice that I'm going over and over to make sure that I get a nice deep penetration. Just as soon as we get this first coat on evenly and thoroughly, we'll put this aside for drying. As our leather dries, you'll notice a slight dull look to it. This is because some of the pigments have not actually penetrated and are still laying on the surface. Now, we want to give this a second coat, but the first thing we need to do is use something like a piece of sheep wool is very good to buff off the excess pigments that are there. I like to use a brush because that kind of gets down in some of the depressions where you've stamped it. Now we're ready to do our second coat. We'll do the second coat exactly like we did the first one. We'll put it on in a circular motion and making sure that we get complete coverage all over the project. And as soon as we get this covered, we'll once again put it aside for drying. We have allowed our dye to dry now and brushed it off to get all the excess residue off. And since we were using an oil and spirit dye, which basically is alcohol, and it has a tendency to steal some of the moisture or some of the oils from the leather, so we will at this point use a conditioner to put a coat of oil on this piece so that it will replace the oils that we lost as the alcohol evaporated out of the leather. Now all we got to do is put this aside and let this dry. We have allowed the conditioner to dry, and we're now ready to apply our final finish. In a case like this, I like to use a nice wax finish. There are several kinds you can use. I prefer the leather balm and atom wax. I just need to wipe it on and put it aside to dry. Our atom wax is now dry, and it's only a matter of polishing it to get a nice, fine, rich-looking patina finish. The more you rub, the better it will look. I'm using a soft cloth for this, by the way, because it is the best thing I have found to do this job. You can give this now another coat of the atom wax if you'd like for even a better finish. So let's take a look at our finished piece. Background dyeing is used mostly on traditional Western leather carvings. It's used primarily to make the pattern stand out. Although it can be done with almost any kind of dye, I personally prefer an oil-based solvent dye for best results. The second thing you need to consider is your choice of brushes. I strongly suggest that you buy only very good brushes. In the long run, they will cost no more than an inexpensive brush because they will last much longer. I have selected today a number 30 red sable brush and a number 3. We'll start with the number 3 first. And first of all, when you dip into your dye, only dip as deep as you need to get some dye, because it will immediately be drawn up into the brush. Take the excess off on the edge of the bottle, and when you place it down on your leather, make sure that you start in the middle. As you can see, as soon as you place the brush in position, much of the dye immediately comes out of the brush. As your brush dries, slowly work up to the borders. We'll take another little dip, take the excess off, again placing it down in an open area and slowly working up to the borders. Now, at this point, it's dangerous for me to try to come into that point. So I will switch now to my smaller brush. Same method, a little bit on, take it off on the bottle, place it not exactly in that pointed area, and very carefully, as the brush dries, work up to the pointed area. Now, I want you to turn your leather from time to time to make it comfortable for you. Always turn the leather so that when you place the brush down, you're pointing it at an angle toward where the swivel knife cut was. This is a method that will allow you to get up real close without the dye bleeding off onto the area where you do not want it. Notice I'm doing most of my work with the small brush. Always touch down first in an area away from a cut or a border line. As we continue to dye, you'll notice that sometimes we run out of large areas and it's kind of dangerous to set the brush down because it might bleed on to somewhere where we don't need it to bleed onto. So there's nothing wrong with going back to one of the other areas and letting the excess come out of your brush. Then you can come into these smaller areas and very carefully work up to the borders and up to the pointed areas. As we're finishing up now with most of these larger areas, I reached a point now where I need to put the larger brush down and go to the smaller one. Now very carefully I'm going into these small areas. I need to tell you that you need to get in these points as good as you can, but don't be concerned if you're not exactly in there, because we're going to show you a method of finishing that will solve that problem for you. So as you get into these areas and get up to these swivel knife cuts, don't be concerned if you're not perfectly in those cuts with your die, because we're going to use an antique finish and a resist that will solve most of those problems. So now we'll put this aside to dry, and then we'll continue with the next step. It's best to clean your brushes immediately after you use them. Using an oil-based dye or a solvent-based dye, you will use a solvent base to clean it. It's just a matter of putting some clean solvent in a cup and making sure on your paper or with a paper towel you've got all of the color out of there. As you can see, I didn't get quite all of it, and it may be necessary to even pour out this solvent and put in another clean cup of solvent to make sure that your brushes are nice and clean. And after you've done that, it's best to point them with your finger, just twist and pull slightly, and then sit them aside to dry in that position. Now after our background dye is dry, it's just a matter of buffing this off a little bit to get any excess pigment off of there. And we'll take a clear acrylic finish. This comes in many brands and many different names. Just a matter of wiping it on. Don't rub too hard, because if you do, you'll just create more bubbles. We just want to wipe this on, making sure that we get nice, clear, clean, and complete coverage. And we'll set this aside now to dry. Our clear acrylic finish has now dried, so we can proceed with our finishing process. What I'm going to do next is apply a very liberal coat of an acrylic antique. I'll do this with a dauber, and I will make sure that I get complete coverage and make sure that I get down in all of the tool marks and the cuts. Remember, I told you not to worry about getting real close into the cuts with your die. This process is what will finish up those very small, tiny areas, because the antique will get down in there. And by the way, I am using a color of antique that's compatible with the dye we used. And by the way, that dye we used was compatible to the lace we're going to use. Now, I have made a pad from a paper towel. I'm going to just lightly skim over the surface, taking just the excess off. At this point in time, we do not want to dig down deep and take the antique out of the lower area. So we just lightly skim across the top and take all of the excess off. Now we'll set this aside for a few minutes to dry, and then we'll come back with a sponge and take some more off. We have allowed our leather to dry for about 15 minutes. Now we'll take a sponge and take most of the water out of it, and very lightly now with this sponge I'm going to skim over the top, taking any excess off. If you don't get it all the first time, put your sponge back in the water, wring most of the water out of it, and then just skim over the top. Now at this point you may have taken too much of the antique out of some of these deeper areas. If you've done that, just take a brush, get a little bit of antique on, and brush it back in those lower areas. And then with your paper towel, just skim over the top, making sure that you don't wipe it out of those deeper areas. You can now do this with your brush into any other areas that you feel need to be a little darker, and you just brush it in, and with your paper towel, rub off any excess. Now I have a little bit of moisture on here. It makes for easy rubbing. As soon as we get all this finished, we'll put this aside to dry, and then we'll do our final finish. Well, we've finished with our antiquing now, and it's nice and dry. It's time to put the final finish on here. I'm going to use a clear acrylic spray. All we have to do is just spray very lightly, because the only problem you'll have with your dyeing and finishing is if you put too much of anything on there. And here we have our beautiful finished piece all ready for assembly. Block dyeing is nearly always done with a spirit or oil solvent dye. It can be done with certain water-based dyes if in fact they are a pure dye. Many times something that's called dye is not really a dye. The acrylic dyes, for instance, are really paint that's especially formulated for leather. They will not work. Only pure dyes. Let's start now by showing you how to make your block. I have here one that I made. I make these up ahead of time and kind of keep them handy for when I'm ready. It's merely a piece of t-shirt material that I have pulled tightly several layers over a block of wood, and have used a stapler to fasten the cloth. Now, it's just a matter of taking your cloth, making sure that you wrap it tight and keep all the wrinkles out of it, and then you can of course fasten it with tacks. Now for today's program I'm going to put this aside and show you how to make one with a sponge. I kind of like sponges because they're not as harsh as the wood. With the piece of masking tape I will fasten it to the side of the sponge. Pulling it taut, I roll it into the material, and then finally take another piece of masking tape, secure it, roll the ends in, take some more tape, and tape those down so that they're not flying around loose. Do the same thing to the other side, pull it as tight as you can, and secure it with a piece of masking tape. We are now ready to do our block dyeing. Notice that there are no wrinkles or anything in here. We'll take our leather and put it on a piece of paper, because like before, we want to make sure that we keep our table from getting soiled. With some spirit solvent dye now, we will put it onto the block. Now, blot that on your newspaper. And now very carefully, just skim over the surface. Do it in a circular motion, and as you'll see, you get a nice effect. Now, stay on the edge to start, and as it dries, you can come in closer to your tooling part. Make sure we first get it on the edge, and then take your time and very carefully slowly blend it from dark to nothing in to where your pattern is. You might want to come back now, put a little bit just on the edge, always blot. And now very carefully, with just a controlled amount on the corner, I'm working my die up to the pattern. I'm kind of satisfied with this now, so we'll put it aside to dry, and then we'll come back and give it a coat of the clear acrylic finish as we did with our earlier piece. Our acrylic finish is now dry, so we can proceed with the application of the acrylic antique, and just like we did before, we'll make sure that we'll get it in all of the depressions and stamping impressions, making sure that we get good clean coverage. And again, with a pad made from paper towel, we'll wipe it off. Now you'll notice that this particular pattern was what we would call an inverted pattern. It's especially nice to do the shade or block dyeing technique. Now with my sponge, I will, as before, just skim over the top. Do this several times until you get all of the excess off the surface and leaving the rest down in. Now let's take a close look at this, and you'll see we have created a beautiful piece. Many leather crafters shy away from the dry brush method of shade dyeing because they think it's just too difficult. Well, it's really not difficult at all. Join me now and we'll show you an easy way to do it. We'll start first by mixing 3 solutions of dye. One will be full strength, one will be 3 parts thinner and 1 part dye, and one will be 50-50 or a 1-to-1 mixture. So let's start with our thinner. We'll put 1, 2, 3 parts thinner in the first bottle, and we'll put 1, 2, 3 parts thinner in the second bottle. Now, to make our solutions, we'll put 1 part dye in the first bottle and 3 parts dye in the second bottle. Now, before we start, we should stir these up a little bit, and let's now, with a piece of scrap leather that we have laying here and our brush, we'll test our 2 solutions. You should always test them before you use them. You can always add a little more dye or a little more thinner. Okay, I'm happy with my solutions now, so let's start on our horse with solution number 1, the 3-to-1. I have selected a larger number 7 size red sable brush now because a wide one will certainly work better than a narrow one. Notice that I'm pulling my strokes from the dark areas toward the light areas, and also I'm pulling them in the direction of the hair flow. Let me show you something now. As you get dye out of the bottle, make sure that you have a piece of scrap leather, and make sure you take practically all of the dye off your brush. Most people have a problem with the dry brush method because they don't get the brush dry enough. Notice also that we lay the brush down. We don't try to dye with the tip. We lay it down. And be patient, because this will take a long time, and it'll be just fine if you'll be patient and make sure every time before you touch that brush to the leather it is almost completely dry, and always start in the deeper areas first. And as the brush gets drier, then you can work out to the lighter areas. This is our solution number 1, so we need to put quite a bit of that on here, but we are not going to cover the highlights. You can probably notice already how my highlights are beginning to show. You'll notice now, as I'm still working with solution number 1, I'm leaving a little bit of space here on the forehead. I'm going to make a nice blaze out of this, and of course you can use the dye now to use the proper color to make almost any breed of horse you would want, and any color. As I continue putting on solution number 1, I've now reached a point where I need to switch to a smaller brush, so I'll go back now to my number 3 brush. Same rules apply. We've got to always take the excess off and get that brush almost dry. Now I can use it in these tighter areas, as you see here, and I'll even come into the nostril now, leaving a little more dye on than normal, but still quite dry. All these small areas now, be very careful around the eye. We're still working from the deep areas toward the highlights. I'm just about finished now with solution number 1, so we'll now switch to number 2, which is the half and half or a little darker solution. First thing I need to do, though, is make sure I put a cap on my first solution and get it out of the way. Going now to the next solution, this is of course darker, and once again we will start in the deepest areas and work out toward the highlights. Now, this being the deepest areas only, we will not use near as much dye, meaning we won't cover an area nearly as large, only the deepest areas. And every time making sure you take the excess off and have almost a completely dry brush. Working around the blaze again on the forehead by outlining it and kind of fading it off into the solution number one, we can make the blaze stand out a little more. And also now, with the brush a little more wet, we'll go into the nostril, being a very deep area, and get it nice and dark in there. Well, that about does it for my number two solution, except I'll put a little bit now underneath the jaw right here to create somewhat of a shadow, because we got to assume here that the light is coming from above. So we'll just do a little bit of shadowing underneath the jaw. Now we're going to switch to the strongest solution, which is full strength, and like we did before, we need to close up the other dye so that we don't accidentally spill some of it. Now I'm going to also be very careful. I'm going to very carefully now put full strength in the nostril. Now, my brush is not exactly dry. It's a little more wet right now because we want to get a good, strong solution of dye in there. Now we'll go back to the dry brush method and put a little bit just in the very, very deepest parts here under the jaw and in the fold of the neck, and a little bit more maybe under here. Being very careful with this. Very, very little. Now we're going to do the ears, and to do that we'll need to turn it slightly so that we get the right angle. And here again, the dye's rather wet, or the brush is rather wet. Get in just the deepest part of the ear. Going back to the dry brush method, we're now going to do the forelock. And the reason I say dry, because when we tooled this, we put this forelock on with the swivel knife by dragging just over the top with the dry brush. It brings out the look of the hair. We'll also do that here where the hair is laying back over. The hair of the mane, that is laying back over the other side of the neck. Take your time, take as long as necessary to get the mane and the forelock to stand out. Now we're ready to do probably the most important part of any animal, and that's the eye. With the horse's eye, they're very, very dark. I'm using now the smallest brush, very carefully going in the eye, painting it very carefully. Turn it so that it's easier for me to put the brush exactly where I want it. I'm going to very carefully paint this eye, not completely solid. We're going to leave one little part natural for a highlight. And for all practical purposes, this is our horse. The last thing we'll do to this piece is give it a protective coat of spray lacquer finish. As we did before, spray very lightly. And that's all there is to it. We have a beautiful horse picture. Here's another method of shade dyeing that you can do without doing all the mixing. It's a real easy way, and let's get started by showing you how to take some yellow dye first, and with our larger number 7 brush, we'll just dye this entire flower. Nothing special about what we're doing, we're just carefully painting it on, and we'll completely cover this flower. Notice how I take the excess dye off the edge of the bottle as we come out of the bottle and onto the leather. It's a disaster if you accidentally drip some dye where you don't want it. So we will completely cover this flower with the yellow. After I have the flower itself covered completely with yellow, I'll switch to a smaller brush. I'm going to just put a little bit of this on the edges of the leaves. Very little bit. This will act as a highlight. Notice that I have taken a little bit off after I come out of the bottle, and take a little bit of it off on a piece of paper so that I don't go on to the edges here with my brush completely loaded with dye.